This is the Atlantic. Sometimes tranquil, more often restless and stormy, willingly submitting to the peaceful uses of commerce, but also passively concealing the treacherous instruments of war. As a highway of commerce, the North Atlantic brings enormous economic benefits to a closely knit community of nations. Yet it also serves as an avenue of attack for any aggressor seeking to weaken and destroy the free nations of the Atlantic community. Shielding the Atlantic from the threat of attack is the Navy of the North Atlantic Alliance, composed of ships like the Dutch cruiser Zeven Provinciën, British attack carrier HMS Warrior, American nuclear-powered submarine Nautilus, a sleek Norwegian destroyer, a new U.S. guided missile cruiser, the Canadian anti-submarine frigate HMCS Assiniboine, a French aircraft carrier. These ships and many more, along with hundreds of aircraft, thousands of sailors and airmen, guard the ocean frontiers of the Atlantic. Each of these warships serves in a dual capacity, under its own flag and under the flag of NATO. This is the story of the Atlantic Navy, naval forces of NATO nations committed to a single supreme commander. The story of its strengths, its problems, and the challenge it has met to preserve the freedom of the North Atlantic community. This Atlantic community, related historically, geographically, and culturally, contains 1/6 of the world's population and possesses 65% of the world's industrial productivity. It grows 36% of the world's agricultural products. It burns 75% of the total world production of fuel, oil, gas, coal. And it owns 46 million tons of shipping, 3/4 of the world's total, to carry the products it manufactures to some 435 million consumers on both sides of the ocean. While the ocean itself is the binding force in linking this energetic and productive community of nations, the ocean, the Atlantic, is also highly vulnerable. In the bloody battle waged on the sea during World War II, the vital lifeline was nearly severed, almost separating North America from the British Isles and Europe. Though victory came in 1945, it was at a heavy price, with homes demolished, factories bombed out, populations scattered in Europe, and millions of tons of shipping sunk. The remarkable energies and skills of the Atlantic community, however, remained intact. Cooperation and mutual aid helped rebuild homes and factories, launch ships and open mines. By 1947, old peacetime ties in trade and commerce were resumed. But a shadow, looming larger all the time, partly obscured the bright picture of post-war recovery and prosperity, the rising threat of Soviet communism. While the North Atlantic nations were demobilizing, mothballing, and even scrapping equipment, the Soviets were maintaining and even enlarging their armed forces. The world witnessed the fate of the Eastern European countries, liberated from Nazi tyranny only to become subjugated satellites of the Soviets. The hope of peaceful cooperation with the Soviet Union was shattered by the Berlin blockade and the intransigence of its representatives in the United Nations. Alarmed by these actions and the attitude of the Kremlin, the Western nations sought collective security in a series of economic and mutual defense agreements, reminiscent of World War II cooperation and alliances. These agreements led logically to the broader alliance of April 4th, 1949, forming the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. On that day, 12 nations of Europe and North America gathered to sign the treaty, and thus NATO became a reality, embraced by Portugal, Italy, France, Luxembourg, Belgium, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, Canada, and the United States. 3 others were to join, Greece and Turkey in 1952, and the Federal Republic of Germany in 1955. In late 1950, the North Atlantic Council, NATO's top civilian policy-making body, created 2 integrated forces under 2 supreme commands, one for Europe and a second for the Atlantic. Today, these 2 commands form a bulwark against aggression. SACEUR, with headquarters near Paris, is responsible for the defense of continental Europe and the Mediterranean. Midway down the U.S. Atlantic coast at Norfolk, Virginia, are the headquarters of the Supreme Allied Commander Atlantic, SACLANT, established April 10, 1952. Naval and military officers of 8 of the NATO nations compose his staff. Here at SACLANT headquarters center the communications, reaching out to naval ships and bases in all corners of the North Atlantic. Here, intelligence on all aspects of the threat to the Atlantic area is gathered for evaluation. And here are generated plans and instructions by which the naval forces of NATO would operate. 12 million square miles of ocean from the Tropic of Cancer to the North Pole must be defended by the forces allocated to the Allied Command Atlantic. Certain areas of the Atlantic are more critical than others, for in times of war, focal points of shipping would attract concentrations of enemy submarines. In the Eastern Atlantic to the seaward of the British Isles. In the Western Atlantic, off the North American coast. And at the approaches to the Mediterranean. Therefore, 3 commands under SACLANT have been established for these areas. The Western Atlantic under a U.S. commander, the Iberian Atlantic area, and the Eastern Atlantic under joint Royal Air Force, Royal Navy commanders. Each of these commanders is responsible for the defense of his sea area, particularly the control and protection of shipping. Fully aware of the strategic significance of the Atlantic, the Soviets, in slightly over 10 years, have built a modern fleet second in size to only the United States Navy. Today, they have the largest submarine fleet in the world, some 450 subs, 10 times the number Hitler had in 1939. In addition, they have 27 up-to-date cruisers, 200 destroyers and escorts. Lending aerial support to this Navy are some 3,500 fighters and bombers, most of which are modern jets. Witness to the near stranglehold that the Nazi U-boat fleet had on Allied shipping, the Soviets have adopted Hitler's strategy with some improvements of their own. Their undersea craft are faster, have longer underwater endurance, and are equipped with more powerful weapons. The submarine threat is no longer confined to ships on the high seas. It must also be assumed that the USSR has the capability of launching guided missiles from submarines. With this capability, the Soviets could threaten ports on both sides of the Atlantic and cities far inland with nuclear attack. Poised against this dangerous concentration of Soviet naval power is the NATO Navy under SACLANT. SACLANT must build a force strong enough not only to defend the Atlantic in wartime, but also be ready to use that ocean for a springboard to launch a massive counterattack against the enemy's key bases. His forces must strike and simultaneously defend. To strike and simultaneously defend, an immense assignment when measured against Soviet naval potential. NATO Navy has its own trump cards. First, the revolutionary weapons that are part of this Navy. And second, the concept of a single Navy under a unified command. Both defensive and offensive power of naval forces has increased enormously since World War II. The offensive power of Sakhalin's fleet is embodied in a force aptly named Striking Fleet Atlantic. Built around U.S. and British attack carriers, it is a mobile, flexible, elusive airfield complex at sea, with its own offense, defense, and support built in. In the Atlantic, the striking fleet would be employed in the closest possible cooperation and coordination with other NATO forces to assure that there is no duplication of effort and that there are no gaps. Every plane and every weapon would be used to further NATO's combined effort in defense of Europe, North America, and the Atlantic. The striking fleet, with its amphibious assault force and embarked Marines, would also operate in close coordination with the forces of the Supreme Allied Commander Europe. Because of its mobility and flexibility, this fleet can be assigned for operational control to any area of the Atlantic, or it can be sent into the Mediterranean. It is geared for atomic war. Because this striking fleet is always on the move, it could not be subjected to pre-D-Day pinpointing for missile attack like the stationary military installations ashore. Its ships can readily wash down atomic fallout, and there will be little residual radiation to endanger operations. Carriers in this fleet use steam catapults to launch the most modern heavy naval aircraft. Angled decks safely permit simultaneous launching and recovery of aircraft. Carrier-based aircraft are rapidly becoming exclusively jet-powered, capable of supersonic speed, armed with air-to-air missiles of uncanny accuracy. Jet naval attack bombers like the A-3D Sky Warrior of the United States can range deep into enemy territory to deliver nuclear weapons. One plane can now deliver the destructive power of thousands of World War II air sorties. A new weapon of great striking power is the transonic heavy jet seaplane, like the US Navy's SeaMaster. The seaplane has an advantage in that it does not have to operate from vulnerable land bases, but can use any obscure harbor, an inlet offering a stretch of water for takeoff, or even the open sea. Base facilities can be provided by a seaplane tender or a submarine. Seaplanes thus could strike at a variety of enemy targets from bases that cannot easily be discovered and destroyed. Another component of the striking fleet is the guided missile ship. This may be a surface vessel, a guided missile cruiser, or a submarine operating with the fleet. Both are ushering in far-reaching doctrines that make naval power even more significant as a deterrent and retaliatory weapon. Defensive operations in the Atlantic take two forms. First, fast-moving hunter-killer groups, which would search out and destroy submarines in northern waters before they could reach shipping lanes. Several nations, including Canada, France, Britain, and the United States, have these hunter-killer teams. And second, close-in support of Allied convoys, Anti-submarine warfare employs a variety of ships and aircraft, specialized detection equipment and weapons, as well as specially trained personnel. Success in this operation demands the close coordination of all units of the hunter-killer team. ASW aircraft carriers, like the new Canadian Bonaventure, carry aircraft designed to probe the depths with the sonobuoy. Other members of the ASW team include planes, like this long-range Royal Air Force land-based patrol bomber, ships, including destroyers, and ASW escorts and frigates like the new French Surcouf and the Canadian Saint Laurent. Paradoxically, the submarine itself has assumed a new role in fighting the underwater marauder. The stubby, maneuverable K-type sub is specifically designed and equipped to strike at the enemy submarine. Once the stealthy and evasive enemy sub is located by an enveloping screen of electronic detection equipment, a variety of weapons can be used to destroy it. Rockets and depth bombs from aircraft, and new weapons mounted on surface vessels. Modern weapons and relentless techniques, whether used aggressively to independently seek out undersea craft or employed in the close-in defense of convoys, offer formidable hazards to enemy submarine warfare. But up-to-date weapons do not ensure victory in time of war, nor promise security in time of peace. Also necessary to a strong defense of the North Atlantic is the single Navy concept. With naval forces pooled under the unified command of SACLANT, plans are jointly agreed on and carried out, with weapons, supplies, and tactical procedures standardized to a high degree. One of the most difficult problems which confronted the Allied Command Atlantic was procurement of logistic support materials that could be used by the armed forces of all member nations so that one nation could effectively support and supply the ships and aircraft of another. NATO has endeavored to attain the maximum possible degree of standardization in fuels, guns, ammunition, electronic systems, and communication equipment. Standardization has also been carried into the operating field. Now, tactics, signals, and military orders are the same. A tremendous job in naval units. Today, all NATO forces understand and respond to the same signals. The staff of SACLANT is constantly developing realistic strategic plans. Detailed studies must weigh all possibilities and probabilities that may be encountered in war. Plans are constantly being revised with the changing world situation, as intelligence reveals new strengths and weaknesses behind the Iron Curtain, and as our own relative strength grows. But plans must be put to the test, and this is the role of NATO Navy maneuvers and exercises. Frequent exercises on specialized warfare lead ultimately to major international maneuvers, which are planned years in advance. Forces assemble at key naval bases in the Atlantic waters. British and American attack carriers, French cruisers and destroyers, Dutch cruisers, Portuguese destroyer escort, Belgian minesweepers, Canadian destroyer escorts, Norwegian destroyers, U.S. guided missile cruisers and destroyers. And at other ports, Danish torpedo boats are alerted for their role in the exercise. For in time of war, it would be their job to prevent the Soviet Baltic Fleet from passing into the North Atlantic. The NATO air squadrons also assemble. Norwegian jet fighters move to assigned bases on the continent. Canadian long-range patrol planes prepare for takeoff. Dutch Neptunes, French Venoms, British Seahawks are alerted. In the United States, Marines are embarked as part of an amphibious force. Each unit, ship, aircraft, all fitting into a predetermined slot, make the Atlantic Command under SACLANT operate as a single coordinated force, all operating under the same NATO plans and the same strategic concept, and therefore far more powerful than the sum of its components. In the training exercise, the NATO forces respond to hypothetical enemy attack from North Atlantic waters. Certain NATO units are assigned to the role of enemy forces. Submarines and aircraft launch simulated attacks. Meanwhile, various Atlantic Command headquarters plot friendly and enemy ship positions. Operational aspects of the exercise are handled here, and orders are beamed to the fleet units from the communications center. On the North Atlantic, the concept of many nations joining into a single fleet is put to a stiff test. Problems that found solutions on paper are re-examined under conditions that approach the real thing. Problems of logistics, refueling underway, rearming and reprovisioning from distant sources of supply with vessels of one nation supporting those of another. All give experience and know-how to personnel at all levels of responsibility. Problems of protecting the naval forces and convoys from the ever-present submarine menace offer no easy solution either on paper or afloat. Practice and more practice, day and night, by the crews of destroyers and aircraft squadrons, bring the anti-submarine units closer to the ideal of a smooth functioning team. After days of grueling operations, the Allied maneuvers draw to a close. Maneuvers, however, are never over for the staff of SACLANT. Even before the fleet disperses for home ports and new duties, conferences are held aboard the flagship. The results of the exercise are studied and analyzed, not so much in terms of who won and who lost, but with reference to the strengths and weaknesses of the NATO Allied Command Atlantic. The maneuvers teach new lessons that are valuable aid in planning future doctrines and showing where deficiencies in training or equipment can be corrected. Exercises also bring together personnel from the NATO nations. Sailors, airmen, Marines, all of whom have been training and undergoing instruction separately, have an opportunity to get acquainted with their comrades and to splice the main brace. Unlike in days past, training today in NATO follows a standardized but progressive pattern. In Norway, sailors learn the maintenance of radio equipment, equipment that is becoming standard through the navies of the North Atlantic. In Denmark, pilots increase their proficiency in British Hawker Hunters, a standard NATO jet interceptor. And in Holland, airmen gain more experience with the American Neptune, a long-range patrol bomber. Off the Virginia Capes, American pilots become acquainted with the mirror landing system. And everywhere, sailors learn the standardized NATO communication procedures. For although many languages are common to the NATO forces, each unit operates and reacts to a unified, pre-agreed communication system. Training isn't confined to the fighter either, as the planners, the men who must outline and conduct the operations, also train and learn together. At the NATO Defense College in Paris, Officers from all the NATO armed services study tactics, maneuvers, logistics, and other doctrines that are becoming uniform through the NATO forces. And so the endless task of learning, teaching, and preparing goes on ashore, at sea, at schools, and at headquarters. In the words of NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Atlantic, United States Admiral Jerauld Wright,
NATO provides not only the strength of pooled forces and combined resources of many nations, but the added strength that comes from organization and coordination. In the Atlantic, the benefits of a unified organization are tremendous. Instead of a half a dozen separate navies, each operating independently, all operate under a single Navy command towards one strategic concept and directed from a single Navy headquarters with an allied staff. We have agreed plans which will be executed uniformly. In these plans, we have a slot for every man, plane, and ship which the combined strength of NATO can make available. We have standardized armament, ammunition, equipment, communication procedures, and tactical doctrine. We are ready to go. Throughout the broad expanse of the Atlantic, the Allied Command Atlantic guards the sea lines of communication upon which each NATO nation and the North Atlantic Alliance itself depends for survival. At bases and at sea, the ships and aircraft of the NATO countries stand ready as a major deterrent to aggression.